Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeffrey and I'll be your host. Today's topic is the indentured servants at the Stephenson House. With the current climate that's going on, with a lot of education maybe going on about the Black Lives Matter movement and monuments being torn down, I just thought this would be a good opportunity to tell listeners and visitors to our website and to our YouTube channel about the indentured servants that the Stephensons had while they were in Kentucky and the Illinois Territory, and then what became the Illinois state. So I think it's just important to talk about the slaves and the indentured servants that the Stephenson family had, because a lot of people don't realize that slavery did exist in the state, and the Stephensons were part of the group that kept it going. And so I just want to give a basic background about the servants. This will probably be a two-part podcast. So this part one will give a brief background about the Stephenson family, how they got some of their slaves, and when they entered into the Illinois Territory. So first off, I'm just going to give a brief background on how Lucy acquired her slaves. Ben actually didn't own any slaves that we know of prior to them being married. So we get the first slaves from Lucy's side of the family. Lucy's father was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and he had land and wealth out in the Ohio Valley. He had children with multiple women, but he made sure his children all received something in his inheritance. So even though he was a bit of a womanizer, he did make sure that every child that he had, they did receive some type of inheritance from him. When her father passed, Lucy received Win as part of her inheritance. Now Lucy could have taken money or she could have taken Win. And she chose Win. As far as we can tell, Win and Lucy were around the same age. At some point, she also acquired Tobe, who was inherited to one of Lucy's siblings. We think one of her brothers had Tobe. So in the end, Lucy actually received 2 slaves from her father's inheritance. Lucy married Ben and they moved down to Kentucky. Still, at this point, Ben technically didn't own any slaves when he married Lucy. Those slaves then became his property since he was the man in the marriage. And obviously, slavery was still legal in Kentucky, so their slaves were not indentured servants at this point. In 1809, Lucy and Ben came to the Illinois Territory. The Illinois Territory was broken up from the Northwest Territory, which consisted of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. At one point, the Illinois Territory stretched down by where Cairo is now, all the way up into Minnesota, and it was gradually chopped up into what the state is now. But the governing document was the Northwest Ordinance, which outlawed the use of slavery in the territory. But indentured servitude was legal in the entire nation. Servitude could have been someone coming over from a ship for passage, or it could have been the legal loophole like it was in the Illinois Territory. The Illinois Territory allowed indentured servitude to continue, and this was the way that Ben and Lucy were able to turn their slaves into indentured servants, because technically speaking, the slaves signed the document stating that they wanted to be indentured to the owner. So slaves didn't have much leeway in becoming servants. Most of the time, you either signed the indentured servitude contract, where you had the potential to become free, or at least be in what is deemed a free state or territory, or most likely, if you didn't want to sign, they would force you anyway, or they would sell you in Missouri or sell you back down to the deep south. So really, you didn't have much choice when it came to becoming an indentured servant. So when Lucy and Ben came in 1809, they registered 3 slaves as indentured servants. Hark, Tobe, and Wynne were the registered servants to Ben and Lucy. Hark was 15 years old and was indentured for 45 years. We believe Tobe had a given time in Lucy's father's will as to when he should be set free. He was 23 and his indenture was for 4 years and 3 months. Since it wasn't as long as Hark's, we assume that there was a stipulation in Lucy's father's will that said that he should be set free at a certain amount of time or on a given year date. Most indentures during this time were not this low. Some were, but most were for more than 4 years, like Tobe's was. When Wynne was indentured, she was 18, and she was indentured for 30 years. So these were the first 3 servants and slaves that the Stephenson family had. They all came from Kentucky when they came up. Wynne and Tobe were inheritance for Lucy. We're not sure where Lucy and Ben acquired Hark or where they bought him, but it was probably in Kentucky somewhere when they were living down there. After 7 months of living in the territory, they acquired 2 more servants. They indentured Hannah for 30 years. She was 25 at the beginning of her indentured contract. At the age of 3, Deborah, who was also known as Dot, was indentured to the Stephenson family. There was no term limit on the indentured record for Dot. When we go through the county records, we don't see a term limit used for Deborah, but sometimes those records get changed or incomplete because certain county registers have them listed as different names. In our system, Deborah is spelled D-E-B-R-A, but in the state register, she's listed as Deb, D-E-B-B. So sometimes those records get lost or they get confused with someone else. So we're not completely sure why her term limit was left off. I'm sure the original one would have the term limit because you would have to stipulate that. It may have been for 30 years like Hannah's, or could have been for less. We're just not sure. What we do know is that they're both indentures started on June 12th, 1810. We also assume that Deborah Dot was Hannah's daughter, since they were indentured on the same day. And since Dot was so young, we just assumed that Hannah was the mother of Dot. Before the Stephensons came to Edwardsville, they lived down in Kaskaskia and Randolph County area. Ben Stephenson was appointed sheriff of Randolph County, so he did have a position while he was down there. And part of his position would have been to sell runaway slaves and or servants. And that's just one of the facts that I wanted to throw out there, that people could have purchased runaway slaves who were going down, either running away from the South or just trying to run away from their current owner in the territory. As far as we know, none of the Stephenson's servants ever ran away, but that would have been one of Stephenson's jobs while they lived down in Randolph County. One of his other jobs was being in the militia during the War of 1812. Stephenson was a major during this war. What is interesting about the War of 1812 for the servants is that he actually took one of the indentured servants with him on campaigns. This was a small scandal among the militia and the military ranks because servants were not supposed to be able to serve and get paid for their work. We are unsure if he took Hark or Tobe with him, but Tobe seems the more likely candidate since he was older than Hark. He would have been more experienced as well. We do have records that the paymaster did have Stephenson's servant listed. The question really arises if the servant was actually given the money for being a soldier and a manservant to Stephenson. And another question that we have is if the servant really received the money for being in the militia, or did Stephenson double dip with the wages received? Now, I mentioned that Stephenson was a major in the war, so he would have been given a little higher pay, and he was also in charge of recruiting men. Some of the men probably didn't join up if they knew that Stephenson's servant was getting paid the same wages as they were, since some of the men would have seen the servant as a lesser being and should not receive the same amount of pay or be paid at all. It still doesn't really answer the question, even with his higher wages, if the servant actually received the money or not. We don't have records that show if their servant really received the wages or if Stephenson gave them. We have the paymaster's records, but we don't know if he actually was physically handed that money by Stephenson or by the paymaster. Our first part was just to give you a background on the Stephenson family, how they acquired some of their slaves and their time in Randolph County and during the War of 1812. Our second part, which will be released next week, will have the Stephenson family moving into Edwardsville and where the servants ended up after Stephenson's death, and just some extra history on the family and where and what the servants did when they moved up into Madison County. I hope this background on the servants gives you just some basic information on how the state worked with servitude and what part Lucy and Ben played into bringing slaves into the territory. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy, and we'll see you next time.